Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that sounds almost impossible from a modern point of view. No personal freedom, not a dragon, not a knight charging across a battlefield, not a king sitting on a golden throne trying to decide which cousin should inherit which castle. We'll save those royal family headaches for another evening. Tonight, we're talking about ordinary people, the farmers, the villagers, the bakers, the shepherds, the people whose names rarely appear in history books because they were too busy trying to survive another rainy harvest season. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe pull a blanket a little closer, set your phone down somewhere nearby, and let your thoughts drift gently back into medieval Europe, a world where roads were muddy, winters felt endless, and almost every important decision in your life had probably already been made before you were born. Because if you were an ordinary peasant, freedom was not really something people discussed very often. You belonged somewhere. You belonged to a village. You belonged to a lord. You belonged to a family. You belonged to traditions that had existed for generations, and changing any of those things was about as easy as convincing a goose to become a tax collector. It simply was not expected. Now, when we hear the phrase no personal freedom, it's tempting to imagine every medieval peasant waking up each morning in complete misery, staring dramatically out of a tiny wooden window, while sad flute music plays in the background. Reality was a little quieter than that. Most people simply accepted the world they inherited. After all, if every person you knew had lived the same way, and every grandparent before them had done exactly the same, it would not necessarily feel unusual. It would simply feel normal. Human beings are remarkably adaptable creatures. We can get used to almost anything, even a society where your entire future is basically decided by the field in which you happen to be born. A child born into a peasant family would almost certainly become a peasant. A blacksmith's son often learned blacksmithing. A miller's daughter grew up in a miller's household. A shepherd's children learned about sheep whether they found sheep interesting or not. Career counselors, as you might imagine, were not especially common in the year 1200. There was no friendly advisor asking, "And what are your dreams?" The answer probably would not have mattered very much. The family needed help. The crops needed planting. The animals needed feeding. Dreams could wait until after harvest. And harvest, inconveniently, always seemed to be arriving. The village itself was a world of routines. People rose with the sun, not because they were particularly enthusiastic about early mornings, but because candles were expensive and daylight was free. Free resources tend to become very popular throughout history. A peasant house was usually small, a single-room building made from timber, clay, and whatever local materials happened to be available. The roof might be thatched, the floor might simply be packed earth. Chickens occasionally wandered inside. A goat might decide that the doorway belonged to it. Personal space was not really part of medieval architecture. Large families often lived together. Grandparents, parents, children, perhaps an unmarried aunt, possibly a cousin, everyone sharing one limited space, while trying not to step on the family dog. If they had a dog, the medieval peasant's day was controlled by the seasons. Spring meant plowing and planting. Summer meant endless labor under the sun. Autumn brought harvest. Winter offered some relief from field work, but there were always repairs to make, tools to mend, animals to care for, and enough firewood to gather to survive the cold months. It was a cycle, a very old cycle, and there was comfort in its predictability, but there was also very little room to choose another path. Let's float gently over to one of the biggest limitations on personal freedom: travel. Today, People think nothing of crossing countries or continents. A quick train ride, a flight, a road trip with too many snacks and not enough patience. The medieval peasant had a somewhat different experience. Many people spent their entire lives within a few miles of the place where they were born, not because there was a law saying they could never leave, although in some places legal restrictions certainly existed, but because travel was difficult. Roads were rough, bandits existed, bridges collapsed, forests were dangerous, and leaving your village also meant leaving your work behind. Fields do not politely harvest themselves while you're off exploring the countryside. For many villagers, the local market town felt like a grand adventure. Perhaps it was 10 miles away, perhaps 20. Stories from distant places spread through travelers, merchants, wandering monks, and the occasional soldier. A man arriving from another kingdom might sound almost magical. He had seen mountains, or the sea, or a city with stone walls taller than any church tower in the district. The villagers gathered around to listen. People have always enjoyed travel stories, especially when someone else had to do the traveling. Now, one group of people had even less freedom than the average peasant. Serfs. Serfdom was a complicated arrangement, and it changed depending on time and place. But generally speaking, a serf was tied to the land. If the estate was sold, the serfs usually remained with it. They worked the lord's fields for part of the week. They worked their own small plots for the rest. They owed labor. They owed rents. They owed fees. There always seemed to be another fee. Need to use the lord's mill. A fee. Need to bake bread in the lord's oven. Another fee. Want to marry someone from another village. That might involve a fee as well. The medieval economy occasionally resembled a game designed by someone who was unusually fond of collecting small payments. Of course, not every lord was cruel. History is rarely that simple. Some were practical, some were fair, some ignored minor rules, as long as everyone did their work and paid what they owed. Others, unfortunately, took their rights very seriously. Human personality has always played a role in government. A kind ruler could make life easier. A selfish ruler could make the exact same system feel unbearable. And medieval villagers had almost no control over which type they received. The local lord held considerable authority. He settled disputes, collected obligations, managed land, provided protection in theory. In return, villagers provided labor and loyalty. It was less a partnership and more an arrangement that had developed over centuries because nobody could think of a better alternative. Well, perhaps some people could think of better alternatives, but suggesting major social reform in the Middle Ages was not usually an excellent career move. The church also shaped daily life. It is difficult to overstate how central religion was to medieval society. Church bells marked time. Saints' days shaped the calendar. Festivals interrupted work. Priests performed baptisms, marriages, and funerals. The local church was not simply a place of worship. It was the heart of the community, and like every important institution, it came with expectations. People attended services, observed holy days, followed traditions inherited from generations before them. Again, there was not a great deal of individual choice involved, but there was familiarity. The rituals connected people to their neighbors, to their ancestors, to the rhythm of the year itself. Oddly enough, medieval peasants probably enjoyed more holidays than many modern office workers. That sounds surprising, but religious festivals created frequent breaks in the agricultural calendar. Of course, these holidays did not involve beach resorts or streaming movies. Entertainment looked a little different. There might be music, dancing, storytelling, a village fair, a traveling performer, juggling objects that probably should not have been thrown into the air. Perhaps there would be food, perhaps a wrestling contest, perhaps someone would bring an unusually clever trained bear. Medieval entertainment had a wonderfully unpredictable quality, and honestly, after weeks of hard labor, watching a goose chase the blacksmith through the village square may have counted as a memorable event. Children, meanwhile, entered the adult world surprisingly quickly. A modern childhood, with years dedicated primarily to education and play, would have seemed unusual. Medieval children worked. They carried water, gathered firewood, watched animals, learned family traits. Little by little, they became useful members of the household. Again, not because medieval parents disliked fun, but because survival required cooperation. Everyone contributed, even the youngest family members. Education itself was limited. Most peasants could not read or write. Books were expensive. Schools were uncommon outside larger towns or religious institutions. Knowledge traveled through conversation, memory, songs, and tradition. A grandmother teaching bread making, a father teaching plowing, a village elder explaining when to plant beans according to local custom. Practical knowledge mattered more than academic knowledge. A peasant might never read a single page of philosophy, but he could identify weather patterns, repair a fence, and judge whether a cow was healthy with remarkable accuracy. Different worlds value different skills, and perhaps that is one of the strangest things about history. People of the past were not less intelligent. They simply lived inside a different system. A system with different priorities, different expectations, different definitions of success. As the evening grows quieter around us, imagine standing in a small medieval village. Just as the sun begins to set, smoke rises gently from thatched cottages. A church bell echoes across the fields. Children chase each other through muddy lanes. Someone is carrying a basket of bread home from the oven. A farmer is repairing a broken wooden cart by the fading light. Tomorrow will probably look very much like today, and the day after that, and perhaps the year after that as well. To modernize that life can seem restrictive. There was little opportunity to reinvent yourself, little chance to travel the world, little personal freedom in the sense we understand it today. But there was also community, familiarity, a place in the world that felt stable, even when it was difficult. And for most medieval people, that was simply life. They did not wake up wondering how to become famous, or how to build a personal brand, or whether they should quit everything and move to a cottage by the sea. They worried about the weather, the harvest, the price of grain, whether the roof would survive another winter storm. Very ordinary concerns, very human concerns. And perhaps that is the curious thing about the medieval world. It often appears distant, strange, almost impossible to imagine, yet beneath the old customs, the feudal rules, and the muddy roads, we find people trying to build decent lives for themselves and their families. People who laughed at local jokes, complained about taxes, argued with neighbors, celebrated festivals, and hoped that next year's harvest would be just a little better than the last. As we continue a slow journey through the world of medieval life, we'll discover even more about the quiet rules, hidden obligations, family expectations, and social customs that shaped the lives of ordinary people. For now, though, let the village settle into silence. The fields grow dark. The last candle flickers softly behind the wooden window. The animals rest in their pens. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a strange little question. What if becoming a king did not actually make your life easier? What if wearing the crown mostly meant that thousands of people suddenly developed opinions about when you should wake up, what you should wear, where you should stand, how you should eat, and even the exact angle at which you should greet your own relatives, because, surprisingly enough, that was often the reality. When people imagine medieval royalty, they usually picture unlimited freedom, a giant castle, a soft bed, a table full of roasted meats and fancy pastries, servants rushing around carrying silver trays, and the king pointing dramatically across the room while announcing some important decision, perhaps about taxes, or a war, or who accidentally insulted the royal hunting dog. But tonight, we're looking at a quieter side of palace life, the routines, the endless ceremonies, the tiny rules, the invisible walls that surrounded medieval kings and queens every single day. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe pull a blanket a little closer, and let's wander back into a medieval palace where almost everything runs according to a schedule that nobody remembers creating, but everyone insists is absolutely essential. Because if there is one thing royal courts loved, it was tradition. A court could survive a failed harvest. A court could survive a difficult winter. A court could probably survive a minor political crisis, but changing the order in which people entered the dining hall, now that was dangerous territory. Our day begins before sunrise, long before the king opens his eyes. The palace is already awake. Servants move quietly through stone corridors, carrying buckets of water and bundles of firewood. Kitchen workers begin preparing bread. Stable hands feed horses. Guards change shifts along the walls. Somewhere in the distance, a sleepy cook is trying to convince a stubborn fire to cooperate, because medieval fireplaces, much like medieval politics, had a habit of doing exactly what they wanted. The king himself rarely woke alone. That sounds rather strange to modern ears. Most of us expect privacy in the morning, a few quiet moments, perhaps a cup of coffee, perhaps the chance to stare blankly out of a window while deciding whether we are emotionally prepared for the day ahead. A medieval monarch was not usually given that luxury. Royal bedrooms were surprisingly public spaces. Trusted servants entered to prepare clothing. Officials waited nearby with messages. Personal attendants helped with washing and dressing. Important nobles might even be admitted during parts of the morning routine. The king's private life was often not particularly private. And if you're wondering whether that became awkward, the answer is almost certainly yes. Imagine trying to wake up while 6 people are discussing government business 3 feet away. Not ideal. But kingship was less a personal identity and more a public performance. Every movement mattered. Every gesture carried meaning. Even getting dressed followed a careful order. The finest garments were selected according to season, ceremony, and political necessity. Colors mattered. Jewelry mattered. Fabrics mattered. A visiting ambassador from another kingdom spent half an hour describing the king's clothing in a written report, not because he secretly wanted a career in medieval fashion journalism, but because appearance communicated power. A wealthy king looked stable. A stable king looked strong. A strong king discouraged troublesome neighbors from doing troublesome things. So the royal wardrobe became a matter of state, a surprisingly expensive matter of state. Some medieval rulers owned robes lined with rare furs, embroidered with gold thread, and decorated with jewels collected from across Europe and beyond. The clothing could be magnificent. It could also be extremely heavy. There are moments in history when it seems entirely possible that a king needed assistance simply to stand upright beneath the weight of ceremonial fashion. Of course he did. No royal mourning was complete without prayer. Religion shaped every corner of medieval life, but for kings it carried additional significance. A monarch was not merely a political leader. He was expected to rule with divine approval, at least in theory. So the royal household followed a regular pattern of religious observance. Private chapels stood within palace walls. Priests and chaplains conducted services. Holy days filled the calendar. The king prayed. The queen prayed. The household prayed. And occasionally everyone probably hoped the ceremony would be just a little shorter, because breakfast smelled wonderful. Human nature remains wonderfully consistent across the centuries. After prayer came audiences. This was where the carefully managed routine became truly exhausting. People always wanted something from the king. A noble wanted a favor. A merchant wanted permission. A bishop wanted support. A knight wanted a reward. A distant cousin wanted land. There always seemed to be another cousin asking for land. Royal families had an extraordinary ability to multiply complicated inheritance questions, and so the monarch sat through meetings, endless meetings. Petitions arrived one after another, disputes between nobles, arguments over property, complaints about taxes, complaints about neighbors, complaints about other complaints. If modern office workers occasionally feel trapped in an endless cycle of administrative tasks, they may discover an unexpected sense of solidarity with medieval kings. The paperwork was different. The feeling was remarkably familiar. Let's float gently over to another curious royal tradition: meals. Now you might assume that a king could simply eat whenever he felt hungry. That would be a reasonable assumption. It would also be mostly incorrect. Royal dining was often a public event. Important guests attended. Servants followed established procedures. Certain officials tasted food before it reached the monarch, not because they were especially hungry, but because poisoning was considered a possibility worth avoiding. A surprisingly sensible precaution, really. The seating arrangements mattered enormously. Who sat close to the king? Who sat further away? Who received the finest plate? Who had to settle for the seat near the drafty window? These details communicated social status with astonishing precision. A single dinner could become a political map. One awkward seating decision might create a grudge lasting 20 years. History is filled with wars that began for complex reasons, but one occasionally suspects that a few started because someone felt deeply insulted during a banquet. The food itself could be extravagant: roasted meats, fresh bread, cheeses, fish, fruits when available, spiced dishes for the wealthiest tables, imported ingredients for special occasions. Yet despite all the luxury, table manners were strict. You did not simply grab whatever looked appealing. There were customs, expectations, rituals, the correct way to serve, the correct order of dishes, the correct behavior in front of important guests. A royal child learned these rules from an early age, and speaking of royal children, they may have had even less personal freedom than their parents. A prince was not raised merely as a son. He was raised as a future institution. Tutors organized his education. Masters taught him languages, religion, history, and warfare. He learned how to ride, how to hunt, how to greet ambassadors, how to sit correctly during ceremonies. An astonishing amount of medieval education appears to have involved standing in exactly the right place while wearing the correct expression. Princesses faced equally structured lives. They received instruction in religion, household management, music, languages, and court etiquette. Many knew from childhood that they would one day marry for political reasons rather than personal preference. A royal marriage was often less about romance and more about diplomacy. Two kingdoms might become allies, because the teenagers had been introduced to each other and informed that history had made a decision on their behalf. A difficult conversation, one imagines. As the day moved onward, kings often inspected the business of the kingdom. Letters arrived from distant castles, messengers delivered reports, officials discussed finances, military commanders requested supplies, taxes were counted, inventories were checked. Royal government depended upon routine. Without organized schedules and dependable record keeping, even the richest kingdom could quickly become confused, and medieval governments, despite popular stereotypes, often contained remarkably skilled administrators. Someone had to remember which noble owed military service. Someone had to know how much grain had been collected. Someone had to organize repairs to bridges, roads, and castles. The king might wear the crown, but behind him stood a small army of clerks, scribes, accountants, and advisors, quietly keeping the entire system from falling apart. Perhaps the greatest surprise about strict royal routines is that they rarely ended. Even leisure had rules. Hunting trips required planning. Guests followed protocol. Court entertainment unfolded according to ceremony. Musicians performed at designated moments. Dances followed accepted patterns. Festivals had carefully observed traditions. A medieval palace was almost like a great mechanical clock. Every person had a place. Every action had an expected order. Every day followed rhythms established by generations that came before, and stepping outside those rhythms could make people very uncomfortable indeed. As evening slowly settles over the palace, candles flicker against stone walls. The great hall grows quieter. Servants clear the tables. Guards patrol the corridors. The king finally retires to his chambers after another day spent not only ruling a kingdom, but performing the endless rituals expected of a ruler. From the outside, the royal life appears dazzling. Gold crowns, fine clothes, grand feasts, magnificent castles. But behind all that splendor stood a schedule so strict that many ordinary villagers might have looked at it and quietly thought, perhaps farming is not so bad after all. And as we continue a slow journey through the routines of medieval royalty, we'll discover even stranger customs, bizarre court ceremonies, awkward dining rituals, exhausting travel schedules, and the curious little rules that turned the lives of kings and queens into one long performance that almost never truly ended. For now, though, let the castle fall silent. The torches burn low. The chapel bells echo softly through the courtyard. The palace servants finish their final tasks, and somewhere behind a heavy wooden door, a very tired medieval king closes his eyes, knowing that tomorrow's carefully organized royal routine will begin all over again. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a strange little mystery. Why did so many medieval kings look absolutely exhausted? You would think being the ruler of an entire kingdom would be relaxing. You have castles, you have servants, you have magnificent robes that probably require 3 assistants, and an impressive amount of patience to put on. People bow when you enter the room. Trumpets occasionally announce your arrival, and somewhere nearby, there is almost certainly a large feast involving roasted meats and far too many decorative candles. It sounds wonderful, until you remember one small detail. Everyone wants something from the king. Always, every hour, every day, for the rest of his life. So tonight, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe pull a blanket a little closer, settle into your favorite chair, and let's wander back to the medieval world, where wearing a crown often meant carrying the heaviest job description in Europe, because behind every glorious painting of a smiling monarch in golden robes was a human being trying to survive an endless parade of political problems. And the problems never really stopped. The moment a medieval king opened his eyes in the morning, politics had already begun. A servant might quietly enter the royal chamber carrying letters that had arrived overnight. A border lord wanted additional soldiers. A bishop was unhappy about a local dispute. A neighboring kingdom had sent a message that sounded friendly, but somehow also slightly threatening. A tax collector had discovered that several villages claimed their grain harvest had been mysteriously disappointing. Again, a noble family was arguing over inheritance. Again, two important dukes had somehow managed to insult each other during a banquet. Again, the medieval world had a remarkable ability to create administrative headaches, and somehow almost all of them floated steadily toward the king. Of course, a wise monarch rarely made decisions alone. Royal councils existed for exactly this reason. Around a great wooden table, advisors gathered to discuss affairs of state. Experienced knights, senior nobles, church officials, royal secretaries, perhaps an elderly counselor who had served the previous king and now spent half his time quietly reminding everyone that things had been much simpler 30 years earlier. Every government seems to have at least one of those. The discussions could last 4 hours. Should taxes increase? Should troops be raised? Should a troublesome noble be forgiven? Should he be punished? Should he simply be invited to dinner and politely encouraged to stop causing problems? Medieval politics often involved a surprising amount of careful conversation. Because open conflict was expensive, castles could be rebuilt, armies could be raised, but repairing damaged relationships between powerful families was much harder, and medieval Europe had no shortage of powerful families. Let's float gently over to one of the greatest sources of royal stress, the nobility. Kings ruled kingdoms, but nobles ruled pieces of those kingdoms. Dukes, earls, counts, and barons controlled land, wealth, castles, and private armies. Officially, they served the king. Unofficially, they also served themselves. This created a delicate balancing act. A clever king rewarded loyalty. He granted titles, organized marriages, distributed lands, invited important nobles to court, listened to complaints, smoothed over rivalries. He became part ruler and part very tired family mediator, because noble families argued constantly over borders, over inheritance, over hunting rights, over marriages. Occasionally one suspects they argued simply because they had argued last year and wished to maintain the tradition. A medieval king could never completely relax. Even a grand feast contained political meaning. Who sat nearest the throne? Who received the finest wine? Who entered the hall first? These tiny details carried enormous symbolic importance. A guest moved one seat farther from the king than expected might spend the entire evening wondering if he had somehow fallen from favor. His friends would notice, his rivals would definitely notice, and by the following morning, half the kingdom might be discussing the matter. The medieval court was many things. Peaceful was not usually one of them. Then there were foreign ambassadors. These visitors arrived carrying gifts, letters, and carefully rehearsed speeches. They smiled, they bowed, they offered compliments about the beauty of the royal palace, and all the while they quietly collected information. How healthy did the king appear? Did his advisors seem united? Which nobles looked powerful? Which ones looked unhappy? who spoke during meetings, who remained silent. Diplomacy was a very polite form of observation. A medieval ambassador was part messenger, part negotiator, and part professional collector of gossip. Naturally, kings had to be careful. A careless comment at dinner might travel across Europe by the end of the month. Human beings have always enjoyed sharing interesting stories, especially when those stories involve important people making awkward mistakes. Marriage, surprisingly enough, created another layer of political pressure. Royal weddings were rarely simple love stories. They were alliances. A king might marry a princess from another realm to secure peace, strengthen trade, or prevent future wars. The couple themselves occasionally had very little influence over the arrangement. Politics arrived first. Romance, if it arrived at all, had to find a convenient place somewhere later. And once the marriage took place, the pressure did not disappear. Now everyone expected heirs, healthy heirs, preferably several of them. A single royal child represented the future stability of the kingdom. A lack of children could create uncertainty. Too many possible heirs could create a different kind of uncertainty. History repeatedly demonstrates that royal families possessed a remarkable talent for turning inheritance into a very complicated puzzle. Let's drift gently toward another invisible burden, the simple act of appearing strong. A king could not easily admit fear. He could not openly display doubt every time difficult news arrived. People expected confidence, even when confidence was in short supply. Imagine hearing that harvests had failed in one province, floods had damaged another, a neighboring ruler was gathering soldiers near the border, and two ambitious nobles had decided this would be an excellent time to renew an old family rivalry. Now imagine being expected to smile calmly through dinner while musicians play in the background. Royal self-control was practically a professional skill. Court life itself offered very little privacy. Servants filled the halls. Advisors requested meetings. Petitioners waited outside the audience chamber. Relatives visited. Clergy arrived with religious matters. Military commanders brought reports. Messengers came and went throughout the day. The king was almost never truly alone. Even hunting trips, which modern films often portray as peaceful escapes into the forest, usually involved nobles, attendants, guards, hunting dogs, and enough ceremony to make the entire event feel like a traveling government office. Of course, there were moments of enjoyment. Many kings genuinely loved hunting. They enjoyed tournaments, music, storytelling, games of strategy, quiet conversations with trusted friends. But even these pleasures could become political. Inviting one noble to a hunting expedition while leaving another behind might accidentally create offense. And offended nobles had a habit of becoming inconvenient. As evening settled over the palace, the work still continued. Royal scribes copied letters by candlelight. Officials counted taxes. Clerks organized records. Advisors prepared tomorrow's meetings. The kingdom never really slept. Someone was always watching a border. Someone was always guarding a castle. Someone was always carrying a message through the night toward the capital. And somewhere in the middle of that enormous machine sat the king, trying to keep everything moving together. Perhaps that is the greatest surprise about medieval monarchy. The crown was not simply a symbol of power. It was a symbol of responsibility, a heavy golden reminder that thousands, sometimes millions, of lives depended upon decisions made by one individual and the people surrounding him. From a distance, royal life looked magnificent. Towering castles, grand ceremonies, beautiful clothing, magnificent banquets, yet behind the walls and banners was an endless cycle of negotiations, compromises, rivalries, and expectations. A king was expected to be brave, generous, wise, religious, strong, patient, charitable, a skilled warrior, a clever diplomat, a loving father, a fair judge, and somehow also remain cheerful while discussing grain taxes for the third hour in a row. It was, to put it mildly, a demanding occupation, and as we continue a slow journey through the political lives of medieval rulers, we'll meet anxious queens, overworked advisors, ambitious princes, troublesome nobles, and entire dynasties trying very hard to avoid the next great family disaster. For now, though, let the palace grow quiet. The torches burn lower in the great hall. The royal scribes close their heavy books. The guards pace softly along the stone walls, and somewhere beyond the castle windows, beneath a sky full of stars, a very tired medieval king is still wondering whether tomorrow's council meeting will bring peace to the kingdom, or simply another argument about who owns a field near a river that nobody can quite find on a map. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a curious little idea. What if the most powerful people in the medieval world were also some of the least free? It sounds backwards. After all, kings owned castles, queens wore crowns, princes and princesses lived surrounded by servants, musicians, and enough expensive fabric to keep an entire village of tailors busy for years. From a distance, royal life looks wonderfully comfortable. Warm fires, long banquets, beautiful gardens, a household where someone else is always responsible for carrying the heavy furniture. But tonight, we're going to look behind the grand palace walls, because the closer you get to medieval royalty, the more you discover that their lives were controlled by an astonishing number of rules. Rules about waking up, rules about eating, rules about speaking, rules about marriage, rules about friendship, and, rather strangely, rules about who was allowed to hand you your shoes in the morning. The medieval court had a rule for almost everything. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe pull a blanket a little closer, and let's drift back into a world where luxury and limitation walk side by side. A world where the crown was made of gold, but the schedule was made of iron. The day of a medieval king did not truly belong to him. In fact, one could argue that it belonged to everyone else. Before sunrise, servants were already moving quietly through the castle corridors. Kitchen fires were being lit. Stable workers were feeding horses. Guards were changing posts along the walls. Clerks sorted letters that had arrived during the night. And somewhere in a quiet chapel, monks or priests had already begun their morning prayers. The palace was awake. Soon the king would have to be awake as well. Not necessarily because he wanted to be, but because the routine demanded it. Royal life was built around ceremony. A king did not simply roll out of bed and decide what to wear. His clothing had to be appropriate for the season, the visitors expected that day, and the image he wished to present to the court. Rich robes, fine furs, decorated belts, jewels, embroidered cloaks, everything carried meaning. A careless appearance could be interpreted as weakness. An overly simple outfit might create whispers among foreign ambassadors. An excessively grand display might annoy powerful nobles who already suspected the king spent too much money. The royal wardrobe was less about comfort and more about politics, and comfort if we're being honest, was probably losing that contest by a considerable margin. The strangest part is that the king was rarely alone. Modern people usually expect privacy. A little quiet in the morning, a few moments to collect their thoughts, perhaps a peaceful breakfast, perhaps a chance to stare out of the window and wonder why life requires so many meetings. A medieval monarch enjoyed very little of that. Personal attendants entered the royal chamber. Servants prepared clothing. Advisors waited with messages. Officials carried documents needing signatures. Important nobles might request immediate audiences. The king's private life was surprisingly public. One gets the feeling that even a quiet cup of water required at least 3 witnesses and a written record. Let's float gently over to another royal inconvenience. Meals. Royal feasts look magnificent in paintings. Long wooden tables, golden goblets, roasted birds, fresh bread, colorful fruits, musicians playing softly in the background. What those paintings rarely show is the endless amount of etiquette attached to the event. The order of seating mattered enormously. The order of serving mattered. The order of entering the hall mattered. Who stood closest to the king? Who was invited to dine? Who had to sit farther away? These tiny details acted almost like a secret language. Every noble at court paid attention. Every ambassador took mental notes. Every ambitious courtier tried to work out whether he had gained or lost favor. A dinner was never simply dinner. It was a political performance with several courses. Even friendship was controlled. Kings and queens could not always choose their companions freely. They were expected to spend time with people whose families were useful. Powerful dukes, influential bishops, important foreign visitors. The lonely truth about medieval royalty that many relationships existed because politics demanded them. A king might trust a childhood friend more than a wealthy lord. Unfortunately, the wealthy lord probably controlled 3 castles and 500 soldiers. Politics had a habit of winning these arguments. Marriage, of course, was perhaps the greatest example of a controlled life. Most royal children knew, from an early age, that they would probably marry a stranger. Not because anyone wished them unhappiness, but because kingdoms needed alliances. A prince might be promised to a foreign princess before either child was old enough to understand what the agreement meant. Years later they would meet, exchange polite greetings, and discover that history had already organized the rest of their lives. Romantic stories occasionally appeared. They certainly existed. But medieval diplomacy generally preferred family trees to love letters. A royal wedding was often treated, rather like a treaty, with better clothing. Let's wander quietly into the lives of royal children. People sometimes imagine princes and princesses spending carefree afternoons running through castle gardens, while tutors patiently waited nearby. The reality was usually more structured. A young prince learned riding, religion, history, languages, court manners, and the art of appearing confident, while much older adults stared at him expectantly. He practiced greeting important visitors. He observed council meetings. He studied warfare. He learned that one day the entire kingdom might depend upon his ability to remain calm over a crisis. No pressure, of course. A princess faced her own carefully arranged education. She studied reading, writing, music, religion, household management, and diplomacy. She learned how to host guests, how to behave during ceremonies, how to represent her family with dignity, and all the while she understood that her future marriage might connect to kingdoms or prevent a war. It is difficult to imagine a more carefully managed childhood. As the years passed, the invisible rules only multiplied. A king could not travel freely. Journeys required planning. Guards, servants, cooks, clergy, nobles, messengers, an entire moving community followed the royal household from one castle to another. Even hunting, which sounds wonderfully relaxing, involved elaborate organization. Dogs had to be prepared, horses had to be selected, routes had to be secured, guests had to be invited. Some poor official probably spent 3 days making lists, while secretly wishing the king would simply stay home. Court life itself resembled a carefully choreographed performance. People bowed in the correct order. Letters used precise forms of address. Ceremonies followed traditions that stretched back generations. The smallest mistake could become a source of embarrassment. Imagine accidentally speaking before a higher-ranking noble, or sitting in the wrong chair, or entering a room before the queen. These seem like tiny accidents, yet at a medieval court they might be remembered for months. Courtiers had astonishing memories for social errors. They could forget a military victory, but remember exactly who reached for the wrong goblet at last winter's banquet. As evening settles softly over our imaginary palace, the castle finally begins to grow quiet. The great hall empties. Candles flicker against stone walls. Servants carry away the last wooden plates. The musicians put down their instruments. The scribes close their heavy books. The king retires to his chamber. The queen withdraws with her attendants. And for a few precious hours, the palace rests. But tomorrow, the same routine will begin again. The same ceremonies, the same obligations, the same careful balancing act between power and expectation. Perhaps that is the greatest surprise about medieval royalty. The crown offered wealth, it offered influence, it offered fame that lasted centuries, but it rarely offered freedom. Almost every hour belonged to the kingdom. Almost every decision belonged to tradition. Almost every relationship belonged to politics. Behind the glittering jewels and magnificent castles stood ordinary human beings, living remarkably controlled lives. People who sometimes grew tired, sometimes felt lonely, sometimes wished they could escape the endless ceremonies and simply walk through a village without attracting attention. Yet history had chosen a different path for them, and so they played their roles, day after day, year after year, generation after generation. And as we continue a slow journey through the hidden routines of medieval courts, we'll discover even stranger customs, unusual royal habits, awkward family expectations, and the quiet little rules that turned Europe's grandest palaces into some of the most carefully managed places on earth. For now, though, let the castle fall silent. The torches burn low in the corridors. The guards pace gently along the walls. The moon rises above the towers, and somewhere behind a heavy oak door, a very tired medieval monarch closes his eyes, knowing that tomorrow will unfold almost exactly the same as today.